Hello and welcome to my review of the Naturehike Vik 1 tent. Now I've owned this tent for about 2.5 years. I've taken it on 6 or 7 camps with me. So what I'm going to do is run through my pros and my cons about it, and I'll finish up with a conclusion which will hopefully help you decide whether or not you want to buy one. The Vik 1 is a single skin, single person tent. It's very lightweight, weighing in at only 1.1 kilos, and these are not expensive to buy at all. This is still £109 on Amazon at the time of filming, and I'll leave a link in my description to that product so you can buy one if you want. This tent is a semi-freestanding construction, so with just the poles clipped into the main tent structure, this tent will stand up. All you have is one peg either side, which holds out the sort of vestibule each side of the tent. Without those it will stand up, but you do need those to be pegged out for it to take its full form. The Vik 1 is a semi-freestanding tent. It has a single pole that runs all the way down the spine, and that splits off into 2 shorter poles at each end. This horizontal crossing pole is permanently connected to the main pole, so all you have to do to pitch it is drop the 4 pole feet into the main structure of the tent, peg out those 4 corners, add 1 peg each side for each vestibule, connect on the little cross pole with its loops, and then add 3 pegs into your guy lines and you're done. It's got a single entrance on this side, and there is a small vestibule on the other side of the tent as well, so you can store some bits of kit in there. I'll show you the inside of the tent now, starting with the vestibule. This is a perfectly good size for a tent like this. This is my Osprey Exos 48 backpack, 48 litres. That sits in there fine with my other bits of cooking kit and whatever stored in here. And moving into the interior of the tent, I've got my Thermarest Nearwear X-Therm Max Regular wide size sleeping mat in here. So with that hard up against the end of the tent, I've got about 10 or 15 centimetres up at the far end here, and I've got my electricals stored down there at the moment. So the foot end of my sleeping bag is currently touching the inner. And if I come round to this side, you can see that the sleeping bag is about 10 or 15 centimetres off the head end. So for anyone who's a bit taller than me, I'm 5'9", which is this many centimetres, you might want to make sure that you are going to fit in this tent comfortably. Over this side we have another little vestibule. It's really just for storage. So there's a little zip down here, and that's really handy just for storing any kit. So I've got my dry bags and things stuffed out there, and you can store anything else you want in there as well. Interior height really isn't bad. I will hit my head on my little lantern up here when I'm sitting in here normally speaking, but I can sit up there without banging my head too badly, and I find it to be quite comfortable. This is perfectly high enough for someone of my height. And if you want a little lantern like this, it's the Flextail Tiny Pump 2X. So of course this will also inflate and deflate your mat or your pillow or anything else inflatable, and then this little lampshade just pushes on to dull that light a little bit, because this is also a lantern on the inside of your tent. I'll leave a link to the Flextail Tiny Pump 2X in my description, and you'll also find a 15% discount code there. Okay, well it's time to move on to my list of pros and cons for this tent, and pro number 1 is going to be its weight. 1.1 kilograms is really light, and that includes the pole. You do get some trekking pole tents in that territory, but of course they don't have any poles with them. You simply use a trekking pole to hold the structure of the tent. So I think 1.1 kilos is really good, and that puts this into the territory of a lot of bivvy bags, where of course you don't have any interior space. Pro number 2 is going to be the tent's pack size. This is only a 1-person tent, but it's got good space on the inside, and it packs down so small that it really takes up very little space in the rucksack. Pro number 3 is going to be the ease and speed of pitching. So I spoke about the structure of the tent with its single pole, plastic clips that just twist into place, and only 9 pegs. All of that adds up to make a really quick pitch, and it takes fewer than 6 minutes to pitch this tent, and I've timed myself doing that before. Pro number 5 is going to be the materials that this tent is made from. This isn't an expensive tent at £109, so you might expect it would be a bit flimsy and weak, but I've actually been really surprised by the quality of the materials, and they feel like they're absolutely up to the job. Pro number 6 is that this tent has been surprisingly good in wind. I really thought that this tent would be good for no more than 15 miles an hour of wind, but I've been out in fairly blustery conditions with winds gusting up to about 30 miles an hour, and the tent has taken it, which I was not expecting at all. Dartmoor is helping me out today because it's quite a windy day. I'm sorry about the noise on the microphone, but you can see that the tent is holding its structure quite well, and even though it doesn't have any real horizontal stability other than this little pole which isn't guyed down at all, there are some loops on the end of the little eyelets here, so you could add some guy lines of your own to anchor the sides down to the ground. Although I'm not going to be using this tent on really high exposed summits in 50-mile-an-hour winds like I might do with my Terra Nova or my Hilleberg, it does give me the option to go out in slightly windy weather, and I don't need to worry that it's just going to crumple on me. Pro number 7 is a bit of a double-edged sword, and it's the ventilation. So there are two great big vents on the roof right up at the top, so any moisture can rise up and flow out. Also, the fly sheet is a few inches off the ground around the edge as well, so you do get good airflow through the tent. I'll explain why that is also a con in my cons section in a moment. Pro number 8 is the really good use of interior space. You might be able to see that the ends of the tent are really quite vertical. Some tents do slope in a bit, and that steals the space where your feet and your head need to be, but this makes much more effective use of the length of the tent. It's also got good head height on the inside, and I find the width to be absolutely fine. Pro number 9 is similar to the previous point, but it's the vestibule space. One-person tents tend not to have very big vestibules, but this one is absolutely fine. It can take my rucksack, it can take my shoes, my cooking set, any other bits of equipment I have laying around in there. I never feel short of space in the vestibule. And of course there's also the bonus vestibule on this side, so anything you're not going to need through the night you can tuck out of the way in there, and that leaves even more space in the main vestibule. My 10th and final pro is going to be the fact that Naturehike fitted this tent with dual zippers on the main door. So you can open the tent as usual from the bottom, but also you can just drop it down from the top, which is really useful for a few reasons. It might be that you want more ventilation because you're cooking in the vestibule. Maybe you just want more ventilation from the inside out to let any condensation out, but it's also really useful because it just means you can drop the top of the door down, peer outside to look at the weather conditions, and if it's a horrible day, zip it back up. Time to move on to the cons. My first con is going to be the weatherproofing of these vents. Now I told you I'd come back and talk about these because these are a pro of mine because they're nice and big. They're also a con. So what I've found is that when you drop these down, they have a nice little Velcro attachment at the top and a little stabilizer rod. There is a little patch of Velcro there that secures the vent down, but it doesn't take much wind force to pop that open. And before you know it, the wind and the rain are driving in through this vent. And even when I've used the tent up in the clouds moisture blows straight in through here. It just rains water in on your sleeping bag below. So that's not ideal. I dare say you could add a little bit more Velcro if you wanted, either side of the main flap, but that's not something you really want to have to do when you've just bought a tent. I'm going to be slightly contradicting myself with con number 2, but con number 2 is that this tent won't be as strong as some other tents in high winds. You can see now the tent is flexing a little bit as the wind rushes in from the right hand side, but this is a single skin, very lightweight tent. It's not really designed to take massive winds, so if you want something that you can perch on top of Ben Nevis or Pen y Fan or some high mountain that's really exposed, this probably isn't going to be the tent to use for that. Con number 3 doesn't really apply to me, but I'm thinking of the taller camper. So this con is interior space, which might be a limiting factor for some of you. As I said, I'm 5'9", which is this many centimeters, and this works out perfectly for me. I'm sitting quite naturally and happily now. My head isn't touching the top. If I really stretch, I can get it to touch, but it's fine for me. Where I think it might be more limiting for some is in the length. Last night was a really damp night. The cloud dropped right down and I measured over 95% humidity. And in conditions like those, particularly in a single skin tent, you will get moisture forming on the inside of the tent. So with the foot end of my sleeping bag occasionally touching the end, the bag did get a little bit damp down there. My head end was clear, so that was fine, but I think if you're pushing up to 6 foot or a little bit over 6 foot, if you use this tent on a damp night like that, you might not have the best night. And that actually brings me on to con number 4 for this tent, which is the fact that it is a single skin tent. That has benefits, like the fact that it's really lightweight and packs down really small, but single skin tents do tend to suffer from condensation issues on the inside. So on a night like last night, where the cloud was really low, there was moisture forming on the outside, but that almost automatically means that you're also going to have moisture on the inside, because it makes its way through the vents, up through the fly sheet, and then it can flick onto your face if the wind picks up and starts rattling the fly sheet, so that's not so nice. I do have a towel in here, so I gave it 1 or 2 wipes off through the night just to stop that from happening. So for that reason, I tend to recommend that you only use a single skin tent like this in really dry conditions and preferably warmish conditions. So I don't really like using this in temperatures below about 5 degrees Celsius. It's also a little bit colder, which is another downside of single skin tents. You don't get quite the insulation you get from a dual skin tent. So if you use it in maybe sort of 8 degrees Celsius plus, and when it's not too damp, the ground here is a bit damp as well as the cloud I had last night, then this is perfect and the condensation issues won't really bother you. We come back outside now for my 5th and final con, and that is the way the outer door is secured. So once you've opened it, you have to take this little plastic hook on the end, bring it round to this side of the tent, and then it hooks onto the peg out strap over this side. Now that's fine, it works, it's simple, and on a day like today it's not a problem at all. But if it's raining, if it's really cold and you don't want to get out of the tent, there is no way of reaching this. There's no way you can reach from inside the tent all the way down to this corner. So I don't mind it. I mean, it's really simple and effective, but it would be convenient if you could unhook the outer door to shut it without having to put your shoes on and walk outside the tent. That marks the end of my pros and cons. So you've got 10 pros and 5 cons to have a think about there. To conclude, I would say that this is a really good tent for warm and dry conditions. It's getting towards the end of May here in the UK, and this is my first time bringing the tent out this year. Given that the conditions were a little bit more damp than I expected last night, I maybe wouldn't have brought this tent just because I had that moisture forming on the inside, but it's not the end of the world and it's really fun to be back out in this tent. Do I recommend it? I absolutely do. It's £109 on Amazon. Remember, I'll put a link to the tent in my description so you can have a click on that. £109, 1.1 kilos. It's cheap and cheerful. You don't often get to buy things that are cheap and cheerful. They're normally cheap and nasty, or they're a little bit more expensive and cheerful, but I consider this to be a cheap and cheerful tent, really good for summer camping, with the small proviso that you maybe want to check that your height is going to work on the inside, just to make sure that it's long enough for you. I hope you found this review helpful. If you have, please leave a thumbs up, and if you've got any questions or comments, drop them in the comments section below. And if you'd like to watch any more of my videos, whether it's wild camping or gear reviews, please consider subscribing. I'll see you on the next one.